I'm sure many of you will be extremely excited to hear Ingvi's talk today. I know I certainly am. Ingvi has said he's very happy for questions along the way, so take that into consideration, and there are even question breaks built into the talk, so thank you very much for that. It sounds wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So, yeah, I think I met most of you by now, but there are some slightly unfamiliar faces. So I'm Ingvi, as was introduced, and I'm a PhD student at DTU, so the hearing systems section in the health technology department. And so we do a lot of work on hearing aids and hearing care and how to improve that and how to develop new methods for that, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. So the title of my talk is The Impact of Background Noise on Decision Making in Triads. So I study group decision making, essentially, like many, or at least some people here have been involved with, I know. And so I want to study how groups make decisions, or I do study how groups make decisions in the presence of background noise, right? So when communication is impeded by noise, essentially, and see how that impacts decision making. Yeah, so I have around 35 minutes prepared of talk and some bonus content if we have time for that. But I got the impression that you ask a lot of questions, so that's great, and I really appreciate that. So yeah, as was said, just shoot along the way. Good. I like to start with this picture, and maybe especially for you here, because I'm usually presenting to people who know a lot about audiology and testing hearing and so on. So, but this, in case you're not aware, is how it typically looks when you go to an audiologist or a hearing care specialist. You go and you sit in a booth, a very enclosed, tight, claustrophobic space, put on some headphones to make sure absolutely no noise is coming into your ears. And what we do then is we present some tones or some speech sentences to people in some very controlled conditions. So this is great, of course, we get a good idea of people's ability to listen and to hear and to comprehend different sounds and sentences, essentially. The problem with this, even though there are many good things about these paradigms, is that they don't correspond very well to the settings where people actually struggle. So something like this. This is definitely not an enclosed booth with no acoustic noise or anything like that. So this is the kind of situation where a person like the one we saw before is typically struggling. And these situations are the reasons why people go and get hearing aids, right? So they want to attend social interactions, they want to be able to interact with their peers and their family and friends and so on. So we want to come up with some way that we can sort of bring this situation into the lab, so to create an interactive setting, essentially. This is our, I call it new, but it's a couple of years old by now, but it's a fairly new lab we have at DTU, which is the co-lab, as we call it, or I try to call it, no one is picking that up. It's the communication lab. And so, as you see here, we have a bit more space, right? So we can fit a lot of people. One of my colleagues had up to 10 people conversing together at the same time. And we have a bunch of different gadgets that people are wearing. So you see these eye tracking glasses, which have head motion tracking, POV camera, gaze point tracking as well. And we have also some microphones, of course, so we can record speech of participants very close to the source, so to sort of filter out the other persons from individual microphones. And yeah, and more coming. I think there's some people from Ivana, some of you know Ivana? Yes, so there's some people from Ivana's group working here now. They want to add all sorts of physical or physiological sensors as well. So that's quite cool. Yeah, so the reason I use this lab is actually most related to the thing you see in the background, which is the noise sources, essentially, right? So you see this array of loudspeakers, and this is what allows us to emulate the acoustic scenario that we saw before, where we can sort of play back a cocktail party scenario, where we can have people converse in a very messy acoustic situation. Yes, so the goal of my work is to say, well, we have these paradigms up here, or this paradigm up here, where we look at listening, right? So how do people listen to different sounds, and how do we quantify that? And we use that to sort of evaluate their hearing ability. But my sort of research question in an abstract or conceptual sense is, can we have something similar for communication? Right? Can we have a metric that tells us, do people successfully communicate in this or that scenario, or with this or that impairment, or this or that hearing aid, for example? So can we directly quantify communication ability and not just listening ability, because they're not necessarily the same, even though they are related, of course. So how can we go ahead and measure successful communication? So there's one common way that people do this, and or at least get at it, and that is to use all of these sensors that are in our lab and similar labs. And essentially the idea here is to say, well, we can measure people's behavior, so the eye and head motion, speech coordination, physiological changes, and so on, and see, do they change in response to noise? And then this change of behavior is indicative that they're struggling, and thus that would sort of indicate that they are not communicating successfully. There's another sort of approach which is more based on tasks, so communicative tasks, where we measure directly performance, and we conceptualize then the goal of communication as exchanging information with each other, or developing a shared mental state about some problem or some topic, and so on. And I'll show you in a minute why this is a picture of a beach if you're not familiar with this one. Yeah, so just to sort of put this all together, I think essentially what we're trying to do is we want to see how communication difficulty in the sense of background noise or hearing impairment impacts communicative performance. And some people say, well, we can look at behavior and say that this relates with performance, so if you change your behavior, then that's indicative of bad communication. I think this is maybe a bit oversimplifying. I think changes in behavior are an adaptive strategy that people use, right? So you can, in response to some communicative difficulty, you can change your behavior in order to uphold a certain level of communicative success, right? So just because you're changing your behavior doesn't mean you're unsuccessful in communicating. So the example I like to use is when you go to the bar and you order a drink, you are behaving very differently than you usually are because you talk much louder, you lean towards the bartender much closer than you would normally, and so on, but you still manage to order the correct drink. Right? So your communicative goal was to order a specific drink, and that's achieved even though you change your performance, your behavior. Sorry.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah. It might be a bit on the side, but where do you see in that picture like rapport and all of these emotional aspects of communication? Right? Because, for instance, I could imagine that to optimize performance, if I'm not hearing well, I might just ask, could you repeat it?
Yes.
Every turn.
Yes.
Right? But that would make you lose face.
Yes.
And I was just wondering where that fits in the picture.
I think a lot about this, but I haven't. So there's of course many social elements that fit into this. So it's a highly social task. You could even say it's more about some people say that conceptualize successful communication as saying the goal is to uphold some specific ritual, right? It's a ritual of communicating. It's a dance, so to speak, that is producing, by successfully following the ritual, you are producing some sort of social rapport or connection between individuals. So I'm an engineer, so I take another perspective, which is people are trying to convey some information to each other, and that's what the goal is here. I'm not saying social aspects are not mattering, of course, but I think communication success necessarily has to be an umbrella term for many different things, and I'm considering one of those. And of course, social elements are also a different part of the picture in that sense. Yes, so what are some existing tasks to measure something like exchange of information between individuals? So this is where the beach picture comes in. So this is what's called the diapics task. And so this is essentially a spot the difference task where you have two different versions of the same image and they have some slight differences. So for example, you see the trash bin has a different color, and the sign here has no text, and this one has some text, and so on. So some of them are very subtle. And the idea is that you give one, so it's a dyadic task, so you have two people and one person sees each of these images, and their task is as a pair to spot all the differences, right, and to identify them. So this necessarily requires them to communicate, and it requires them to exchange information with each other, so that's sort of, a good starting point. This one's a bit more complicated, but essentially a very similar idea. It's a sort of maze where you start, again, each person sees one side. You start in the corner, and there are some rules about which tiles you're allowed to step on, and you have to sort of take turns telling each other what is the allowed move, and then you have to reach the other side or something like that. So these are a good starting point, and there are a bunch of studies that have looked at communication in different, noise levels or with hearing impairment and so on using these tasks. But in terms of quantifying performance, they don't usually do very well. So either it's not reported because the authors correctly realize that they often result in ceiling performance. So what I mean by that is that people tend to solve these puzzles. No matter how difficult you make it, they will take longer maybe, they will have to use another strategy, but they tend to always solve the puzzles in the end, right? So that leaves you with either you have to say, well, but if it takes you longer time, then you're doing more poorly, which is not necessarily the case, I think, because successful communication is not necessarily efficient communication. So that's an issue here. The other issue is that they enforce some very particular communication patterns. So in terms of external validity, these are not very good, I think. So, for example, these tasks here, so one of my colleagues has administered a bunch of these, and he said a very common strategy that people tend to use, or pairs tend to use in this task, is essentially one person will scan the picture, and the other person will just say yes or no. Right? So one person is describing what they have, and the other says, yes, I have that, or no, I don't. And that's how they solve the task. So this is, of course, a very convenient strategy for this particular task, but it doesn't really engage and reflect the or many of the negotiative aspects of communication, like whose turn is it now, and so on. And yeah, similar with the other task here. Yeah, and then finally, these are only applicable for diads. And I think this is an important thing because many of the most challenging situations that hearing impaired individuals find themselves in are exactly because there's more than one person that they can talk to. Right? So they have to sort of negotiate whose turn it is, they have to split their attention between multiple individuals, and these tasks simply don't allow for that. Yes, I'll just move this one. Yeah, so this is where my study comes in. So I, based on some existing literature in the group decision-making literature, I developed a sort of task which we can use to see how people in triads exchange information with each other in an externally valid setting that captures this essence of information exchange. So it goes something like this. So I prepared a sort of quiz, a bunch of quiz questions for these participants. So they come in triads, and before they do any communication, they have to individually decide on these questions, right? So they get a question like this: which of these countries has more inhabitants? They get two options: Netherlands, Romania, and a slider here, which they use to indicate how confident they are in the decision, right? So middle would be no preference, and the extremes would be I'm completely certain about this answer here. After that, there is a group phase. So this is where the fun happens. So they discuss, and they are instructed to view it as a collaborative effort, so that it's equally important that they improve each other's answers as that they improve their own, right? So they're encouraged to both share and ask for information from each other. And they do this in different levels of background noise, and that's what these loudspeakers here indicate. And as you might have anticipated, I want to then see how do they change their answers afterwards, right? So after having discussed, they repeat the questions once again. And the idea then is that if we can have some sort of model of the decision-making process, we can say, well, we know what they knew before, and we know what they thought afterwards, and how did the intervention, let's put it like that, the discussion, how did that change their views based on what was available and based on whether or not there was background noise present in the discussion. So that's the general idea here.
Sorry,
yeah.
I just forgot to listen.
That's fine.
The last phase, they could revise the original lines.
Yes,
Right?
yeah, exactly.
Do they see their initial answer, or do they have to answer from?
During the posterior decision, no, they answer from, so they don't see what they'd said before. No, yeah.
And can they see each other's confidence in the group
No.
phase? Do they
No.
discuss how
No.
confident they are?
Well, implicitly, but not explicitly. So they don't. So what happens is they do 28, I think, of these questions. So it's you can't really recall exactly where you put the slider in any
so
case.
they do 28.
Yes, yeah, that's
in
not
this
entirely clear here, but they do many different questions. Then they discuss them all, and then they repeat the questions.
And in the last stage, you said they can't see the confidence ratings of the others? Or the
That's correct. Yeah,
choices?
they don't
No?
see those. Yeah,
Huh?
they don't see those. That's correct. Yeah,
But what about their own? If
they
can-
also don't see that.
Is it trial by trial? You seem to say that they go through all the individual
Yeah.
ones, then all the discussions, and then
Yeah.
all the posterior.
So the details here are that these 28 questions, they together make up a list of 8. So there are 8 countries in a list, and there are then 28 unique pairs of countries in that list. So they answer all the pairwise questions, and during the discussion they have, maybe that's most visible here in this video I have. So you can see the sheet down here. This is the sheet indicating all the 8 items in the list. So that they have that as a sort of reminder of what they were just answering questions about without having the explicit pairwise questions presented to them.
Okay.
Can you just say a few more words about why they do all of the trials first stage initially,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
all of them in the second stage?
So the initial idea was simply efficiency. So that this is a way for me to get a lot of trials and have them still discuss in a brief period of time, essentially. So the loop would take a long time, the experimental loop would take a very long time if I had to have them do an individual question, discuss that, repeat, and so on. So this was for efficiency reasons, essentially. Yeah.
Time basically.
Yeah.
And lastly, what about, do they ever hear about whether they were correct or not?
At the very end, but there's no feedback during the whole loop here. Yeah.
Did they have unlimited time in the group phase to discuss, or was there a constraint on that?
There was a constraint in practice. They never reached that. So they had 10 minutes maximum. Well, they did reach it, but only in. I was there listening, and it was only when they were anyway sort of getting off topic. So I don't think they were ever limited by that in practice. Yeah.
What about the order of the questions? Were they the same order before and after the discussion?
Yes.
In the same order for all participants as well? The 3 that are discussing together?
I think so. Yeah. Yes. There were some technical reasons for that. I had to compile some Unity programs in a specific way. So yes, but ideally, of course, they would be shuffled. Yeah.
And are you going to say a bit more about the participants?
In just a sec. Yeah. Yeah.
Just very quickly. But basically, so they had to take a decision, so they would listen individually to the different questions. Then they would discuss different questions with the background noise, and they would take a decision within that discussion, and then take another decision individually.
So
and you
no-
will see the differences between those
No
decisions.
explicit decision was made or recorded during the discussion. So what happened in practice was, so I just told them you have now 10 minutes to improve your own and each other's answers as much as you want. So you can share and exchange and elaborate and so on, but they didn't have to submit anything. So all the submitted answers are made afterwards, privately and individually.
Okay, so then it would be interesting just to know from you, like, if there is like some kind of difference when it comes to the decision making, in the sense that people might say, like, okay, I'm gonna choose that, and
Yes.
actually because of the individual decision making, I'm gonna choose something completely.
And this was very deliberate on my behalf, that I didn't want this sort of joint decision, because
Okay.
I think that that might activate. So there might be some other social things at play there,
Right.
about there is a social incentive to reach consensus, so you might give up more quickly or whatever.
Okay, or the opposite, like social conflictuality because of positioning, because of how the people are aware, like, how the people gesture, how they
Yeah.
speak,
Yeah.
how,
Yeah.
like the class problems and so on and
Yeah.
so forth.
So
That would be interesting.
the conceptualization is, I have a starting point, and then I share my information into a pool,
Right.
and I'm free to draw from that shared pool afterwards, and then I'm at another point afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the sort of the idea here. Yes, yeah, just a few more details here about the experiment. So we had 30 participants, so it's 10 triads. They were all young, normal hearing. So that is between, I think, 20 and 35, so with no hearing loss by self-report. The conditions that they were doing this task in were 2, so there's a noise condition which is 78 dB, so that's quite loud. It's not nightclub loud, but it's very loud, let's put it like that, especially when you're sitting in a very quiet lab and suddenly it goes. And then there was a quiet condition which was essentially just to, so I include a little bit of background noise just to mask out like me in the background shuffling around or whatever, just to not distract them like that. So this is essentially completely quiet. Yes, all the data that I recorded is based and that I'll present today, so I won't talk about these sensor data and so on. So everything I'll talk about is these decision data on this scale here, which I code as -50, which is the extreme in one side, and +50, which is the extreme in the other side, and 0 in the middle here. Yeah, I want to then talk about the decision-making process. So how do the decisions change from before to after, based on what's available in this shared pool, so to speak. And I have 3 metrics I'll go through. So one is what I call convergence, the other is staying and switching, and the third is the voting strategy. You had a bunch of questions already, which is amazing. So, but if there are anyone still hanging about the experimental design,
Just wondering where the hearing aids come. Is that
Yeah.
next?
that's the next study, hopefully. So for now, recruiting hearing participants is difficult, and especially when you have to do a group. And so there are many considerations you have to take into account. So the first step here is a methodological proof of concept sort of way. Yeah. Yes.
I guess they have to have done more than the 28 questions.
Yeah. Yes. They did 6 rounds of 28 questions.
Thanks.
Yeah. Good. Okay, let's continue. Yeah, so jumping into the analysis. So how can we look at these prior and posterior decisions and say something about, how did people share information with each other? So one of the first things I looked at was this, what I call the convergence, or have come to call the convergence metric. And so what I'm interested in here is I'm saying, well, let's look at their prior decisions, and contingent on there being a disagreement. So for all the disagreement trials, how often do they end up making the same decision afterwards? And again, so this is where it's important to note that they're not making the joint decision together. They're individually and privately making the decision. And how often does that decision correspond to every other person's posterior decision? So the reason I thought this was an interesting metric is to say, well, if you again imagine this shared pool of information, if you draw the same conclusion after having shared into the pool what you have, that indicates that the pool is the same for every participant, right? So if everyone shares what they know and how confident they are in that, then you would expect people to evaluate that information in the same way and thus make the same conclusion afterwards, right? And the thought was then that, creating this shared consistent pool of information is more easy to do when there is no background noise. So because there's less noise, so you're more certain about what people said, about how certain they were, for example, in this or that topic. Yes?
Because we're interrupting a lot. Are you also considering that there could be another mechanism here involved, that's not necessarily just purely auditory interference, but also cognitive load interference? So if there's a lot of babble going on, that might reduce your perceptual capacity. Your executive capacity to filter out the noise.
Yeah, I haven't thought explicitly about that, but yes, for sure, that's a possibility. Yeah. Would you expect that to mostly impact something like recall, or also like during the discussion?
It's more sort of cued by the shared pool or a shared representation of information. So it's more thinking of it in terms of working memory, sort of loading into and out of semantic memory or
Yeah.
whatever memory system
Yeah.
you're using for this,
Yeah.
having some sort of limitation on your executive caused by
Yeah.
that sort of outside sort of increases in volume that are distracting could be distracting that retrieval, consolidation, whatever process,
Yeah.
retaining that information, so that it degrades the shared pool of information, not just on the sensory end, but also on the sort of retention end of the individuals being
Yeah.
able to bring up those points.
Yeah, I haven't. So
Who's
this.
thought?
Yeah. But this information pool is more like a conceptual idea. From I haven't explicitly modeled it as a generative process or anything like that. So it's more like a mental image for myself, at least, to say what is it that people might be doing in this. But it's that might definitely go into some sort of model of that process. Yeah. So as I was saying, I expected this when I first, came up with this to be that it's easier to reach this consensus or this shared mental representation in quiet because it's more easy to communicate. And this was what I found. So this was exactly the opposite of what I expected, which was very puzzling for me for a long time, right? So I had told myself the story that this is how it must be, and that was definitely not how it was. So I found that in noise, interestingly, people were more prone or more likely to reach consensus after having discussed. And I also checked just to be sure, if you look at pairwise disagreements within this group, right? So there's 3 pairs in a triad. How does the analysis look then? And that's the same story, as you might have guessed. So people tend to converge more in noise, right? So they reach consensus more often in noise, or reach the same posterior decision more often in noise, which is interesting. So this led me through to a couple of other considerations, and that's the next thing I'll show you. So I wanted to see, so these are essentially sort of a derived metric, right? So in order to reach convergence, you need 3 particular individuals to make a specific decision on whether or not to switch or stay with what they had before, right? And so I thought, well, let's just dive into that then specifically. And so if you and I have a disagreement like this, so I say Netherlands and you say Romania, I have 2 options, right? So I can either stick or stay with my own decision, or I can switch to your decision. And I thought, let's look at that. So what you see here is, I'll show you on the x-axis the difference in confidence. So remember we had this rating from -50 to 50. And so here I'm just looking at the absolute difference. And if I am more confident than you in my decision, remember it's contingent on a disagreement, so we make different decisions here. If I'm more confident than you, then we have a positive number here, and if you are more confident than me, we have a negative number here. In the prior decision, yes, exactly. And so on the y-axis here, you will have the stay rate and the switch rate, which are mutually exclusive. So either you stay or you switch, and we have a sort of percentage here, which indicates that. These are the individual trials. So you have them split by condition. So blue is the quiet condition, and red is the noise condition. And you see them also split by the decision made after the discussion, right? So these are the stay trials, and these are the switch trials down here. And if we add logistic regression just for the quiet condition to begin with, we see this nice positive slope. And this simply indicates that confidence actually matters for this decision, right? So the more confident I am compared to you, the more likely I am to stay with my own decision, right? So this is a good sort of sanity check at least, right? And again, if you are more confident than me, then most likely I'll switch to your side after having discussed. In the noise condition, we see the same effect, but with a stronger slope, or steeper slope, right? So this is interesting, and what does this mean? Well, if you consider the extreme cases, we have two ends of the spectrum, essentially. So we have either a sort of infinite slope, which is a step function at 0, for example, and this would indicate sort of, so maximal sensitivity to confidence, right? So if we have an infinitely steep slope, it means as soon as you are 1 point more confident than me, I will always switch to your side, and opposite. If I'm 1 point more confident than you, I will stay with my own prior decision. And conversely, if we have a flat or no slope, it would mean that we have no sensitivity to confidence. So in other words, I'm just seeing 1 vote for, 1 vote against. I have no preference for either, right? So confidence doesn't matter at all. Question?
So is there a difference between your two conditions in the absolute confidence? I mean, are people on average less
No.
confident in
Yeah.
the noise condition?
No, and you wouldn't expect, so the questions are, since the questions are asked, the confidence ratings are made before the
Oh,
noise is even presented.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but it's a valid question still, but yes, there is no.
Because I would say that they would be less, confident in the discussions or sharing of information when there's a noise environment, because there's, everything is less certain.
At least on the receiver side, I agree.
Yeah.
Right, so you could say something like, I have a cue or an opinion with some confidence. If I don't adapt to the noise at least, and I just present it in the same way, then you as a receiver will be more likely to say, I'm not quite sure I heard what he said, but I think he said he was fairly certain about Romania, or something like that, right? So my judgment of your confidence will be degraded, and I will take that into account in that sense. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion. Is also related to the relation between how people, the confidence that people submit on their rating and the confidence that they express, right? Because I'm assuming that that's the same, but that's not necessarily the case. But again, I think it's fair to assume that there's no effect of noise on that part, because they're making the decisions before the noise is presented.
I think that there is also evidence that the more overconfident you are, the less you are likely to listen to others or revise your answer. In light of social, even though you might benefit from it, you're less likely just because you're.
So they got trade. Yes.
I just thought it might be playing into it.
Yes, okay, so looking back at the difference in slopes here, what we see essentially is that the noise condition has a steeper slope. So the noise condition is closer to this situation up here. So in other words, we have a steeper slope in noise, so confidence has a larger impact on the decision to stay or switch in noise. Right? So if I am talking to you in noise, it's more decisive for your or mine outcome how confident I am, essentially. What's the difference in confidence between us? So one way to really show this is with the last metric here. So this is based on what's called the voting strategy. And these are also something you'll find in some of the group decision-making literature. And you'll find these terms confidence slating and majority voting. And these are related to the extremes I was talking about before. So confidence slating essentially means when a group is making a decision between, or when a group individuals disagree and they have to reach a joint decision, they can use what's called confidence slating, which is essentially the most confident member will decide the outcome after the discussion. Conversely, they can do majority voting, where they say the most popular option is the one that's going to be chosen afterwards. These are some very simple models of decision making, essentially. And so an interesting case occurs here where we have a dichotomous choice between the two, because that's of course not necessarily the case, but sometimes it occurs that you have a minority member who is the most confident and a majority that is less confident than this one member. Right, so in these cases, which happen to be around 10% of the trials I recorded, we can ask what is the relative rate of the confidence slating and majority voting strategies that these groups make. And yeah, so the picture that this shows is quite compelling. So you see in the quiet condition, the two options are more or less equally valid or equally likely to occur, right? So confidence slating and majority voting. And in the noise condition, you see that confidence slating is a much more likely alternative. So people will more likely than not pick this person rather than this person if they are discussing in noise, but not if they're discussing in quiet. Yes, so again we see this effect that confidence matters more in noise if you are to predict the outcome of the discussion, of the decision after this discussion. Yes, so what's going on here? So I think what's going on is that we have some sort of a trade-off or interaction between the effort required to voice your opinion and the information that you have or is contained in this opinion that you want to share. So I think of it this way. So if you are participating in this task, you have essentially you have some information and you can choose whether or not to share that with the group, right? And choosing to share that comes at some cost, and you have to weigh that against the information content that is in this queue. Right, so we have on the x-axis here, we can put the information content or the confidence, essentially, in our case. So high confidence means I'm likely to share this with you, and low confidence means I'm likely to just not care about it because it doesn't matter as much for decision making. And on the y-axis here we have the noise level. So high noise level would mean I am more reluctant to share because it's very pricey in terms of effort, both for me but also for you, as you might have to start a discussion about this, especially if you just voice an opposing opinion. And so yeah, we have some sort of gradient here, right? So these are the cues that are going to be likely to be shared, and these are going to be unlikely to be shared, right? So high noise level, no confidence, it doesn't matter. It's fine. You can decide. So we can put some sort of arbitrary sharing threshold here. Of course, this is very simplified, but let's just say that everything in this area down here is going to be shared with the group, and everything up here is not going to be shared. And a trial could then look something like this, right? So in the quiet condition, we have again this example with one very confident member and two less confident members picking the opposite. And so here, all of the three options, or the three opinions are on the green side, right? So everything is shared with the group, and they all have access to all the information to make the decision. And as you can maybe anticipate, when we increase the noise, who is going to fall on the bad side of this threshold first? Well, that's the low confidence opinions, right? And what do we have left on the green side? That's the high confidence individual here. So this would explain why in the noise condition, the high confidence individual is the one that has the strongest impact, because they are actually the ones that are most likely to be sharing what they think, right? There is some support for this explanation in the duration of the discussions. So you see that in the noise condition, people are conversing for a shorter time, and in the quiet condition, people are conversing for longer, right? So this could, of course, there could be many things that are impacting this, but one thing could be that people are simply holding back their low confidence opinions in the noise condition because it doesn't matter to share them as much. Yes?
Can you go back and check?
Yes, so no. So, but I want to do that for the next study, as we talked about. And so the reason is related to what we discussed in the design before. I was not anticipating these findings, so because I designed it in such a way that they answered 28 questions, then they discussed the list, and then they answer the questions again. It would be extremely tedious for me to go in, if not impossible, and see when are they talking about a specific pair, right? And thus to label who is saying what about something that they are less or more confident about. And maybe more fundamentally, I should say just that they aren't really in the discussion discussing pairs. They're discussing the list, right? So what happens is they go, well, I think France has the most. Right, so it's a more of a ranking exercise essentially in the group discussion, that it's a pairwise comparison. I treat it as if that's the same, but you might rightly challenge that. Questions here? Yes.
Do you have measures of behavior that you can analyze in the group discussion? For example, to also check if the gestures become more extreme, to really convey this is important what I'm saying. Or other things.
Yes, we have that. So we recorded speech, head motion, eye gaze. I have a colleague who is working on that sort of side of the project. So she, for example, she found that people look more at each other in the noise condition, which is a replication of common findings, that you use some sort of lip reading, or you focus more on gestures, could be, and they use less time looking at their own sort of sheet in the noise condition. Yeah.
So the scale that people are reporting on, would it make a difference if you sort of scale? I guess that from my own experience with working with similar data, that people use scales very, very differently.
Yeah.
So have you considered that? And for example, would it make a difference if you rescaled the data so that everybody was on the same scale, so to speak?
Yes, so that's, yeah.
Or have you tried to look at whether confidence and actual correctness is linked, because that would sort of be and argue against the
Yeah,
other, against scaling?
Yeah, I had. So it's a completely valid point. So I considered it briefly and then thought against it. So commonly, specifically and especially in perceptual tasks where people are discussing, you'll see that you normalize or scale the data in some way. I did not want to do that here because these are general knowledge questions, and it's completely fair to expect that one person has a broader range of confidence than the other. Right? So you might have a situation where you invite someone who is just not very knowledgeable about geography, and thus they tend to use the lower end of the scale, not because of a personal bias to use the scale in a specific way, but simply because they are not as confident. So I didn't want to scale it in that way. But still there might be, of course, an individual bias in how people use these scales. And if you pass by my office, odds are that this is exactly what I'm working on now with a Bayesian modeling of these, a scaling parameter essentially that's participant specific, and add that to the model. Yeah.
I have references for that if you want. I have
Great.
Who's working on a PhD in Australia on this exactly that topic.
I would love to.
Like personality scales and sliders
Yeah.
and all sorts of stuff.
I would love to see that. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, I was wondering, so you basically have the video recording of the interaction. Why not going for conversational analysis? In the sense that you actually, the only way to prove what you're saying is actually to know exactly how that conversation is going on. Not only the duration, but what is said, how it's said, how the interaction is kind of paraphrased, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Probably, I'm on the social side of things, sorry. But at the same time, it's really, really difficult to extrapolate non-sociality from sociality. It's kind of so much artificial, and you could actually just involving a social linguistic person or just conversational analyst, you can really strengthen your argument and just kind of go into that and just decide, because for instance, one of the things that you said, like in relation to agreement as having the same pool of information, like a basic social linguistic theorist would just say, actually no, disagreement is the basis for which we actually have the same information, and because of that we disagree. So actually we prove the exact opposite, and then agreement would be that we probably don't understand each other enough, so we decide to avoid conflict.
Yes, okay, yeah.
So then, it's interesting because you can play around this, and until you don't know exactly what's the content of particular cases, then it would be very difficult to, because if you actually have a content analyzed and see the interaction that actually repeating themselves in a condition of noise in particular, that would really strengthen your argument. That would be just, you could really make very generalizable conditions, but at the same time also a little bit more socially grounded, I would say.
Yeah.
So instead of just, shying away, actually
no, but this is, I'm so glad you said this. This is exactly why I came to very exotic Aarhus for my exchange. Because I was really hoping to get this sort of input, and that's really great.
Have you met Jakob, who's like 2 doors down from you?
No, I don't think so.
So he's like one of the Danish
Jakob,
experts.
yes, yeah.
Jakob Steense, he's one of the Danish experts in this area, so go knock on his door and ask him about
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Great.
It will be very valuable because you have the data, and if you have the videos and you have a controlled environment, of course, it will still be like a very experimental environment, but because you have that data, you just need a person to do the work. Right?
Yeah.
So that would be great.
Yes.
But that's where Jakob would disagree, right? That would say, this is
not a real
representative.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Of course. But that's. But you can do the analysis, as an anthropology, kind of go more adaptive to this kind of settings, and probably you just go for, it's an analysis of an experimental setting. And of course, it wouldn't represent reality because, no experimentation represents reality. But at the same time, it is, good enough, or maybe at least,
You would also say that in this case, as far as I understand, you can't really disagree on the correctness of these. So if you have all the information, then everybody will agree. Is that true? If someone knows how many people live in Romania and the Netherlands, then there's no disagreement.
Yeah. So
whether you believe in the other one when they say that it's 14 million in the Netherlands and
in the context of the experiment here, that would only be I mean, that would only be represented as a very high degree of confidence, and not there's no uniqueness about being correct.
No, it was the example that he gave with everybody sharing their information, and then you decide to disagree. And there are lots of real-world problems that can have that as an outcome. But I guess your questions don't really. The more information you have, the more you agree.
Yes, and this is another. So there's a very interesting perspective on this, which is the modeling and everything is the exact same regardless of what kind of questions you have. Right, so I've seen very similar setups where they use very opinionated topics, right? Where it's like, how do you, like a jury kind of setting where you have to make a moral decision or something like that. You can have a very similar methodological setup, and still with the very important distinction that there is no one correct answer. And there I would expect, for example, convergence rates to be much lower, right? Because there is no intrinsic belief in the fact that there is a correct answer. So it's perfectly valid to disagree in that sense. But yeah, it's potentially very different outcomes depending on what kind of questions you ask in these settings. Yeah. Mette?
You said that at least the hypothesis that you're presenting here for why you see this difference is this trade-off of effort to information. Have you considered other kind of hypotheses that you could also test on this data, or like that would maybe your colleague in Sweden would disagree and say no, it's actually because of this or whatever?
Do you have anything particular in mind, or?
I'm asking a little bit more open-endedly. Maybe we can do something. But
yeah. I guess this is my pet for now, but I'm very open for alternative explanations. Yeah.
Or I guess a different variant of that is that you presented as an argument for this hypothesis that the duration is longer, but it's a kind of, like was said, a little bit coarse-grained, or like there could be many reasons.
Absolutely.
And it's easy to think of ways where in noise it's just not pleasant to talk no matter what.
But that might also be related to this, right? That because it's not pleasant, you just say, sure, I'm not that confident anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
But you're only measuring the y-axis in your data, right?
Yeah, so I have essentially just two levels in the y-axis because I have two conditions. Yeah.
But you want it to be connected to the x-axis, and the data doesn't really allow you to do so.
Well, so in this illustration, the x-axis is conceptualized as the confidence level, so that your confidence corresponds to the information content, so to speak. So the higher you judge your confidence, the more that means that you are estimating this opinion to be important for decision making for the group.
So I repeat my comment then. What you're showing is just that it's less pleasant to talk in noise, not anything related to confidence.
In the second one.
In the data, on the graph, that's just the duration. They talk less when there's noise.
Yeah.
What you could have is if you had a measure of how much each person is speaking in each trial, and connect that to the confidence, and make the assumption that they are actually speaking about their decision.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then you could more directly measure.
Absolutely, and that's then back to the fact that I cannot measure that here because it's hard. I can't disentangle individual questions, so it's hard for me to say. Well, if there is a trial where one person is just unconfident on every single question, I can see if that person talks less. But that would probably be averaged out by them answering many questions in the same round, essentially.
You said that that's hard to disentangle because there's 28 combinations, but you also discussed analyzing this as a kind of underlying, at least for this example of populations. You can consider all these combinations as just picking out two data points from an underlying scale that you're probably like, oh, okay, you have a ranking that you're moving things around. So maybe if you analyze it like that, you would only have to get estimates from the 8 items rather than all 28 combinations. Maybe it's more feasible.
I thought about this for some time. I never really got anywhere. I think I ended up realizing that there was maybe overcomplicating things a bit, but you could probably also model it as a ranking task, essentially, in the pre and post decisions. Yeah.
There's some work on some of that, and Josh has to, I think there's some references again.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah.
On that kind of modeling.
Yes. Cool. Yes.
Could I have? I mean, this is very interesting, and I would like to ask maybe a general question which comes back to the initial motivation of your work.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you contrasted the classic listening tests, which are all about comprehension, with something which could be more naturalistic matter for communication success.
Yeah.
But then, especially the conclusion that you arrived at is very much about information sharing. So I wanted to ask, how do you do communication, and what other aspects of communication would be important besides information sharing?
Yeah. So we touched upon this a little bit with the social aspects of communication, of course, are still very important. Again, so I'm focusing here on this one particular part of the umbrella of communication success as information exchange. And so the reason, the way I think you can, so relating this back to the initial motivation of hearing impairment and quantifying the difficulties or the struggles of hearing impaired people essentially, and how we can alleviate those, is so in a very abstract or conceptual sense, what you see here is that the environment, noise, impacts how people make decisions. And making decisions is a very, I would say, crucial part of why people communicate. So if you extrapolate this a bit and say, well, if noise impacts decision making, then likely hearing impairment is also impacting decision making. I haven't tested this yet, but I would love to do that at some point. And if you would find something similar, right? So if you find that having a hearing impairment deteriorates your ability to participate in decisions, I think that's a very profound thing, like a very profound negative consequence.
Maybe you find that it improves.
Yes, or it might be that you have more of a say because you just, you can't be bothered to listen. Yeah, exactly. It's something like that, yeah. But essentially, so yeah, the point being that if hearing impairment has a negative impact or some impact on decision making, I think that is indicative of, or could be indicative of some real life struggles that people with hearing impairment experience. And if we can then quantify how a hearing aid, for example, could reduce those, then we would be closer to something that tells us, are we actually helping people with what they want to be helped with? Yes?
So I just get stuck on this slide. So you looked at the differences in confidence and looked at some sort of measurement of whether you stay or go. But you could also relate it to the duration to see whether people who disagree more talk for longer or shorter, and see if that is affected by your noise.
People who disagree, so pairs that disagree more.
Yeah, you could some sort of variability in your confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Use that as a measure for across the 28 trials that you have lumped together, and see whether that measure is correlated or in some way with the duration.
Yes.
Because if everybody agrees that Denmark is just the best country in the world and has whatever Netherlands or Romania, so then there's nothing to talk about. So that's an effect that you have in your data that you want to look at.
That's true. Yeah. So there are, as I said, a bunch of trials in each question, and yes, sure, there were some groups where they were by chance all very unknowledgeable about a specific topic, and these are some of the very low end of the scale here. So of course it has an effect, but yeah. So I could probably strengthen my argument by including that in this.
It's also linked to your hypothesis on the left about how confident you are in whether you're very confident or low confidence. Then if that is distributed in a certain manner in your triads, then that should affect the duration.
Yeah.
If your hypothesis is true.
Yes. So I guess that would. So this doesn't explicitly say anything about, or my idea of this doesn't explicitly say anything about the duration, but sure, you might expect that if there's only one person who is above a certain threshold, that there is nothing to discuss and they just say what they think and they continue. But yeah, so you could add a layer of it which relates that to the expected duration, essentially.
I'm conscious of time now. Do you have a concluding slide?
Yes. Sorry. Are we?
Yeah.
Is it ending at 12?
We normally end around 12.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. No, it's I have a couple of points here, I guess. Yeah. So maybe if my thing works. Yeah. So yeah, we covered this a lot, but what I want to do next is, yeah, as you were talking about, Mikkel, as well. So get a bit more concrete with this hypothesis that I have in the end, right? So do a repeat experiment where I have pairwise presentations, so present a pair, discuss, repeat, and then I can very explicitly see who is talking for how long, for example, who is sharing even in a specific trial, and relate that to their confidences in that way, yeah. And yeah, so as I also mentioned, I'm explicitly working on an explicit model of these Bayesian effects, Bayesian modeling of these effects with majority voting and confidence slating, and also these individual biases that I need to talk to you about, and how those affect also the decisions. Yeah, and hearing impairment. Does hearing impairment affect the information exchange in the same way? That's still an open question, but I think there is reason to dig more into this based on what I found with just noise. Yes?
I guess there's the time scale difference, right? Where if you're exposed to noise here and now, that might affect you in a certain way. If you're repeatedly exposed to noise and the successive social dynamic, atypical social dynamics, that might actually impact in a different way, right?
You mean that as in the sense that hearing impaired individuals sort of are conditioned, or like that they are used to their condition, or?
Yeah, making a very stupid scenario, right? I might be very loud and give my confidence no matter what, right? And now you blast noise at me, and I might just continue no matter what, right? But if you were blasting noise at me like over many weeks every time I speak, then I might sort of start changing the way I behave in a more pervasive way than in the here and now, or vice versa. We could have a habituation effect.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Which is something,
No, but this is actually very real. I mean, it's very common to see or read about, many people, and this is also part of the motivation for this, like, hearing impairment is the main predictor of dementia. And people are hypothesizing that this is related to the fact that people withdraw. When you have a hearing impairment, you withdraw from social context because it's simply too difficult. Right? So you stop engaging with individuals, you stop, training your brain, managing these social situations, and that sort of leads to dementia or related depression. Also is very related to hearing impairment. So it's definitely the case that it is impacting people. And that's really what we want to try to get at here is, can we sort of somehow relate that to behavior? Yes.
Yeah, that's actually relates to my question, because I guess you're now simulating a situation where you have 3 people with the same hearing impairment, right? So in that sense, you say it could be different from a situation where you're the only one with a hearing impairment and you are communicating with these 2 people and a lot's going on and you're kind of only picking up on part of it, right? So maybe it could be kind of interesting to look at those kind of situations where there's an asymmetry in
absolutely
in your access to what is going on, and I guess the prediction could be that that hugely like enhances the effect in the sense that now you're maybe even more certain that there's things that you're not picking up on, right, or something like that. So it could kind of give you that withdrawal effect, perhaps, being the only one who.
Yes.
Of course, that requires you to somehow create a situation where you can, with headphones or something.
Yeah, we have some ideas about like in-ear phones where we can covertly have one person, become the hearing impaired individual or something like that. So we have some ideas, but it's not realized yet. Final question, maybe?
So I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we can also discuss over a sandwich.
I'll pick one which is more general about, which relates to some of the same points. This has a basis in dealing with the problems that hearing impaired people have, right? People using hearing aids and so on. And is it, as I understand, it's the case that with people with hearing impairment or hearing aids, that's very strongly related with work-related stress or stress predictor. Right? That's a really strong. Those two co-occur quite a lot. And one of the reasons is that when people work for extended hours with hearing impairment or function in everyday life, it's over an extended period that they experience a lot of fatigue, a lot of exhaustion. So they can get by maybe for shorter time periods at the same level as everyone else, but then they crash, right?
Yeah.
So you get extremely exhausted. So the main impairment in that sense is after a while, maybe after work, or when you in the evenings or so on. So in a task like this, you would see the main effects towards the end, or maybe after a couple of hours. But if you include people with hearing impairment, they might do just as well as everyone else because they concentrate more, so they compensate somehow. And I know this from experience because I use hearing aids.
Okay,
so that's why it's also very interesting to me. But that's something that I think would be missing quite a lot from this kind of approach, that you don't detect differences that you might see in the real life phenomena, where it's over an extended time period somehow. And I know that's very hard to simulate in an experimental setting, but in that case, the conclusions should reflect that, right? Or there should be some kind of adjustment to the ideals or sort of what you hope to obtain. Because in a short time period, I don't think the main impairments happen there. But I certainly agree that the noisy environments don't really, I mean, those are more naturalistic than the ones that we do when we go for the checks. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of the more general real life problems that people with hearing impairment have, and that it's really over a extended time that the fatigue kicks in.
Just to very briefly answer that, I can. I just want to flip it on its head maybe and say, if you say you might find that people with a hearing impairment do just as well. You might. I mean, so the idea here is that maybe they don't. Right? So maybe there is a fundamental, like, direct effect of difficulty on performance. Right, so that it is beyond their capacity to adapt, regarding to the picture I had in the beginning, in a certain situation or with a certain hearing impairment, right? That you are actually not able to fully compensate even for any amount of time, right? And of course, I mean, surely there is a fatigue thing also going on, right? That you can do it for some time, and this is also a foundation for just looking at behavior, right? So saying that if you change a behavior, that's something that requires more effort than usual behavior because you want to minimize effort regularly. So if you change a behavior, you're using more effort, and thus, that's a sort of way to get at that, right? And that's also a valid approach, I think. So, but I am interested to see, can we find a direct effect, essentially, of difficulty on performance, regardless of any possibility of changing or adapting. Yes, thank you so much.